lesbian GameStop manager, but that's who I am. I wasn't a manager when this happened, just a lesbian GameStop. And it was when I had been at GameStop for about a year and a half, at around October 2014 when I was about 22. We were still in the era where a conventionally feminine female gamer was something of an oddity, at least in my town, and we're long past that, thank God, but it could get a bit tiresome. Now you're probably imagining my story's going to involve the worst in a long line of terrifying incel male gamers hitting on me at work after crawling out of mom's basement. Now maybe that happened occasionally, but honestly in my experience that whole stereotype is just played up and played out and nowhere near as common as people think. And now your listeners are going to be calling fake or plant or whatever, but I swear this has always been my genuine experience. I know there are plenty of weird gamer bros out there, but well, I think this story itself is proof of why you can simply never tell who's going to be like what. It was October and GameStop were bringing in some extra staff ready for Christmas, and particularly the release of GTA 5 on PS4 and Xbox One that month. And so I wasn't surprised to see one or two new faces, but I was surprised when one of them was another girl. I was glad that I'd have someone for some girl talk, and what I wasn't looking for was a relationship. I was with someone at the time, so I didn't even consider that's where her mind could have instantly been going. She was a bit shorter than me, with a nose ring and a bad green, blue, and pink dye job to her badly cut hair. It's easy to be uncharitable now because I know what kind of person Amanda is, but I hope I didn't cast judgment on her at the time. She was just a normal, young, alternative girl, really. It's just now looking back that she developed into a monster in my mind because she truly is one. Amanda was really intensely friendly with me, but in a way she tried to hide with some very sarcastic ambivalence. I didn't pick up on this at the time, I just felt a bit confused. And it was like she was bursting at the seams to get to know me, but wanted to play it cool and act like she didn't care. She had this weird way of speaking where she'd start out talking really fast, and then slow down after the first sentence like she was mentally putting the brakes on. Kind of like Nardwar. Now, when we first met, she'd rushed over ahead of our manager, Dan, and already introduced herself. She abruptly gave me a hug, which took me aback. Coworkers didn't just typically hug me, so I wasn't used to it happening all of a sudden. Also, I'm not particularly a huggy person when it comes to strangers, especially. And she told me she was Amanda, even though Dan had already introduced her. And then she said something like, "We're going to be working together. Isn't that so cool?" Now, she said this like we knew each other from school or something, like we were old friends. Now, I probably paused too long scanning her face, trying to place if I actually did know her. Now, she told me that we'd gone to high school together, and I had this very sinking feeling. Had I shared classes with this girl and completely forgotten or ignored her? And then she added that she came to GameStop all the time. Now, it later turned out that the reason that I didn't remember her from high school was that she'd started her freshman year when I was a senior. Now, we didn't have classes together or even know each other or have mutual friends or anything like that. We'd simply attended the same high school for 1 year. And of course, because we were both women, I was put in charge of Amanda. Now, showing her the ropes and teaching her how to work the register, how to take inventory, the usual, I was kind of flattered that they trusted me enough to have another employee shadowing me, since I hadn't even worked there myself for 2 years. Now, things were fine with Amanda at first, if a little intense. She'd always stand right next to me when I showed her things, kind of pressed up against me, and she was almost a head shorter than me, but sometimes she'd lean in so close that I could even smell her breath. And God, her breath reeked. I don't know what it was. It wasn't standard bad breath. It was something that she'd eaten. I'm sure of it. Like boiled eggs or something, but I never actually saw her eating egg. It was unpleasant to the point of unbearable, and it took all my willpower not to recoil away on more than one occasion. Now, Amanda just did not click with me. I didn't enjoy her company or find her interesting to talk to. Amanda felt differently, though. She would constantly find excuses to talk to me or hang around on break and during work hours, and she would talk non-stop about things she liked or movies she'd seen or bands she listened to and, of course, games she played. Now, I very quickly noticed a pattern with all the things that she talked about. She was constantly telling me things that she liked or hated, just bombarding me with information about things like she was trying to force her tastes on me in the weirdest of ways. She never stopped to ask if I'd listened to said band or watched said movie or what my opinions were on any of the things that she was talking about. She would just sort of go on about how much she liked, say, One Direction, or The Conjuring, or Marvel movies, or some such. I didn't really pick up on it at the time, but there was no defining genres or themes or any personalities to her tastes. It was like she was just sort of naming random popular things at the time to talk about that had no connection to one another or painted any real picture of her identity. If you've ever met someone like this, you'll know what I mean. Like they're not a real person. She obviously did watch the movies and listen to the bands and play the games, but she would talk about them relentlessly. She usually loved the things she talked about, but occasionally hated them to the point of almost unsettling rage. But it was just the most bland, wide-ranging set of subjects, like someone Googled popular things and was just checking them off. Now, eventually I had enough, and I had to ask Amanda to chill and give me a bit of space, and it was kind of driving me insane. I sort of expected her to take it badly. Now, what I didn't expect her to do was try and kill me and then act like nothing happened. I would cycle to and from work in those days. I had a license, but my apartment was close and I didn't want the cost of vehicle upkeep, and so I always kept my bike in great condition. But one night, cycling home in the dark, my brakes failed at the bottom of a hill and I came skidding off into the gutter. Now, it could have been much, much worse. There was one intersection on the way home and that could have been lethal. I know those brakes had been screwed with. They hadn't been cut or anything. The nuts were just loose, causing the grip to slip and not function immediately. Just the type of thing that I was pretty meticulous about checking when I did my weekly upkeep on the bike. Now, I didn't mention the bike incident to anyone at work because I didn't have proof, and I could have been completely wrong. But it was just a couple of days after that when Amanda's demeanor towards me completely changed. She was still as overly friendly as possible, still forcing her company onto me whenever she could at work, albeit slightly less often, but this is where things did a 180 to become intrusive. Instead of ranting at me about pieces of pop culture, she suddenly switched to relentless questioning. What movies had I watched that week? What games was I playing? What's my favorite song? Who were my favorite bands? What shows were good? What did I recommend? Just constantly a barrage of questions. There was no pause to take in information or to discuss anything I brought up. She wasn't actually listening to my answers, or at least I didn't think so. And soon, what felt like a spark of interest became insulting, and I realized that it wasn't worth answering properly because she didn't actually care. And so I'd give a brief, abrupt answers to pretend that I hadn't heard, and then she started asking about things that weren't pop culture related. Where did I live? Did I like anyone at work? Who had I dated in high school? Stuff like that. And thankfully, that only went on for a couple of days and I managed to avoid having to give her any personal information. But good Lord, I didn't think that I could have taken this for long without snapping. Now, I'm not sure why I decided to answer her, and so confidently too, when she asked me if I had a partner. I don't know if I was hoping that maybe she had a whole bunch of homophobia waiting in the wings and would just leave me alone when she found out that I was gay. I have no idea why I'd have assumed that she didn't already know, and so I told her I'd been with Laura, my girlfriend, since 2012, and we were thinking of moving in together. Amanda, I swear to God, went white. She literally started trembling slightly, and I was actually concerned that she was having a seizure or something. Now I asked her if she was okay. Amanda nodded, staring at me in a deep, intent way that gave me chills to this day. And then suddenly she blurted out some kind of sentiment like, "I'm so happy for you," and swept me up in a huge, overly tight, uncomfortable hug and then stepped back, beaming, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Now this was obviously the point that I knew something was very off about Amanda. Thankfully, she wouldn't be in my life much longer, but it gets oh so worse before it gets better. Amanda became absolutely obsessed with The Last of Us. Now that sounds par for the course in 2024, but back then the sequel wasn't yet out, and we had the original and then the remastered version on PS4 and Xbox, and Amanda actually bought a copy of The Last of Us Remastered that same day, but I thought nothing of it at all. Why would I? Everyone was buying it. Now one day, Amanda walked up to me in the break room and literally thrust that Last of Us box into my face. Now I remember what she said next precisely because it was so insane. "I would love a relationship like that. Someone who will fight through the zombie apocalypse for me." Then she paused. "With a girl," she added, staring intently at me. She had this real piercing yet blank stare. This expectant stare that says everything and nothing all at once, and the more you get to know the person, the more vacant and creepy it seems. Now, I said that was cool, something vaguely dismissive. She says, "I think I'd make a good lesbian." I just responded in silence. "Yeah, I think I'd be good at pleasuring other girls." What? I was still in silence. I'm attracted to girls. To other girls." Now me in silence, and at this point I am cringing internally so hard my ovaries feel like they're gonna explode. "Yes, I realize that I'm attracted to girls because..." And as she began to say this, blessed Hail Mary, the door opened and our coworker Matt walked in. Now Matt is the goofy, cheerful type who takes nothing seriously, and you can never really get mad at him thanks to that. "Hey, I'm also attracted to girls," he said jovially. Now I could have kissed him at that point for absolutely decimating the tension. Man, if hateful looks could kill though. Amanda could have been on trial for murder at that point, as she glared at Matt in a way that I'd never seen anyone glare at anyone else before. Even Matt, completely unfazed by anything, stopped in his tracks. He was clearly taken aback and asked if something was wrong. I protested, laughing, and insisted emphatically that it wasn't. And anyway, my break was over and I was due to get back on the store floor. Now that night, I called Matt up and decided to finally tell someone else at work how uncomfortable Amanda was beginning to make me. Now up until now, I just kept it to myself and Laura because I'd feel like crap if I'd affected someone else's employment because they made me personally uncomfortable. But today had just been super weird and creepy, and like Laura said, we'd be expected to immediately act if a guy behaved like that towards a woman. Matt wasn't dismissive. He actually took it very seriously and said that he'd help me swap shifts if I needed to avoid Amanda, and that in the meantime, I should stick near him and he'd make sure that I wasn't caught alone with Amanda at work. And to this day, I really appreciated that. A week later, I received the first note. I found it in my jacket pocket when I got home one day after work. "You're a cock-teasing little bitch. Stop leading me on. From Matt," it said. And so I showed it to Laura, and then I called up Matt and told him what Amanda had done. Because of course it was freaking Amanda, not Matt. Now we decided to wait and try to catch Amanda in the act, and it was the only way to ensure that something could be done. There was no real danger of anyone actually believing the notes were from Matt, but there would be no way to prove that they were from Amanda either. It took another 2 weeks and another 3 notes before we caught Amanda at it. Now during that time, I made a point of avoiding Matt. No confrontations, no mention of anything, but I wanted to give the impression that I was at least wary and buying it. And the second note had also slipped into my pocket during work. This one said something about me being a series of slurs that applied to queer people and how I'll burn in hell. And the next note was taped to the seat of my bike and said much of the same. Only this time it was written on some toilet paper, unused thankfully. In the end, we caught her by pure freaking chance. We've been trying to come up with a great plan to catch her in the act, and in the end, we just walked in on her slipping the note inside this Tupperware container that held my lunch. Of course, she tried to protest immediately. She'd seen Matt putting something in my lunch, so she wanted to check it out. I said I didn't believe her, so she tried to stab me in the eye with a fork. One minute I was yelling at her, and the next minute, a fork was flying towards my face, held by a snarling Amanda. And she went from 1 to 100 in a second. I tried to fight her off, holding her wrist, trying to keep the fork away from my freaking face. With her other hand, she was clawing at my stomach, trying to... I don't know. She knew I had a belly button piercing, and she was trying to rip it out. I shoved her away hard, and she slammed against the refrigerator. I looked for something, anything I could grab, and there it was. A Master Chief replica helmet that a manager had put in the break room. And he was so proud of that thing, and we weren't supposed to touch it on pain of death. But I figured he'd probably understand when the alternative was my death. And so I snatched up that Master Chief helmet, the pride of GameStop, and swung it as hard as I could straight into Amanda's face. The helmet crunched, and so did her nose. Blood exploded over the prop replica. Amanda hooted and tried to lunge at me with that fork again, and I swear to God, this was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I'll never get it back. I swung my leg back and planted a kick right into her crotch as hard as I freaking could. She dropped like a sack of potatoes. The manager came rushing in after hearing the commotion, and so did Matt. It wasn't hard to prove that there was no way Matt could have put the note in my lunch, and circled back around to the shop floor, met up with me, and then re-entered the break room. There were witnesses. And when Amanda started yelling about how Matt had confided in her that he was obsessed with me and how I kept rejecting him, well, that's when we didn't even have to try proving her guilt anymore. And so I asked her why she tried to stab me in the eye with a fork, and her answer was, to protect me from Matt. You literally could not make this stuff up. One other funny twist to this, though, is because Amanda never bothered to actually learn anything about me, the object of her obsession, she had no idea that Matt is my first cousin. And so that's how my weird, creepy, obsessive GameStop coworker got fired, for trying to frame my cousin for harassing me. Obviously, the cops got involved, and Amanda was going to be charged with harassment and attempted assault. And in the end, though, we had to settle out of court because I'd smashed her face in with that Spartan 117 helmet, and while things would have likely turned out in my favor, I didn't want to go through the prolonged court case when we could just settle. At least she was banned from the mall, though. Now, I found Amanda on Facebook a couple of years ago. Obviously, I didn't add her, but it was remarkable to see how much she'd visually changed. She's married to a man and has 2 very young kids, and I really hope that she's changed as a person and isn't an insane melting pot just waiting to bubble over. I hope she dealt with whatever sickness caused her to act the way she did towards me. When I last looked on her Facebook, which she keeps publicly visible to all, I saw that she'd recently become the youngest ever board member of her area's local HOA. So as to whether she's less crazy now, who can honestly say? This is a pretty messed up story about something that happened to me in the late 2000s. This is the first time I put it all down on paper, even though I've shared this story privately a lot, so please bear with me. In the fall of 2008, I was in my senior year of high school in a small town near Atlanta. I just turned 18 and was a typical outgoing girl, I guess. Nothing really remarkable about me. I was just normal. I did gymnastics, I was dating a football player, not the team captain, but a solid player, and we weren't on track to be prom king and queen, but we were pretty popular and friendly kids. And I wasn't a beauty queen, but I was happy with how I looked. I always imagined that you had to be a really extra special to get a hyper-obsessed, dangerous stalker, and I couldn't have been more wrong. And I guess that's why I didn't take it too seriously when it started. Friday, September 26th. That date is ingrained into my mind because I've had to repeat it so many times in retellings and reports, and that's the day it started. The day Logan Nelson added me to MySpace. I didn't recognize him, but I accepted his friend request right away. And I wasn't very picky back then, and online security was far from a concern for my stupid self. Oh hey, someone who wants to be your friend? So you click accept and get the thrill of number go up. Now I knew from the outset that this Logan Nelson's profile wasn't him. It was MySpace Tom crudely photoshopped with Joker makeup. And I guess MySpace Tom has the Joker amused me, so I accepted Logan's friend request and thought nothing of it. Later, I got an alert about a post on my MySpace wall. It was from Logan. And then he said something like, "Hey, seen you around school. You seem cool." And I just replied asking if we had any classes together. Now, he replied with a simple yes, which was unhelpful, so I stopped replying and went ahead with enjoying my weekend. Saturday was the last barbecue of the year with the family and my boyfriend Kyle's fam, and the weather would be turning soon, so it'd be a time to put the grill into storage for the winter. My Uncle Chris, Dad's brother, famously grilled a mean steak, and our barbecues would inevitably turn into large neighborhood events, with dozens of people coming and going throughout the afternoon and evening. Towards the end of the night, when the various kids in attendance had settled down and things were a bit quieter, Kyle came up to me and asked who Logan was. I didn't immediately remember the guy who added me to MySpace, so I asked for some context, and Kyle let me in inside and showed me a note stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet, and it said, "Hey Sandy, you look great today. Good enough to eat. Logan." Creepy. So I remembered Logan Nelson from MySpace and told Kyle about him, and we tried to work out who Logan Nelson was and if we'd seen him at the barbecue. Now, Kyle eventually figured out that Logan could be this quiet, unassuming kid who had a few classes with us. He dropped by the barbecue at some time in the evening, Kyle said. This kid, if I was thinking of the right guy, was a band geek type. Certainly didn't strike me as the type of guy to leave a smutty message on my family refrigerator. And that night I posted on his MySpace wall asking if he'd left the message. And his reply was, "Well, yeah, you like it?" I didn't say yes or no, but asked if he was Logan from Chem in Spanish. "Lol, yeah," came the response. Mystery solved. Strange, creepy, and annoying, but solved. Kyle and I confronted Logan the next time we had class together. Logan was absolutely baffled and said he'd never put anything on the refrigerator. Kyle kind of got up in his face, and I swear Logan was about to piss himself. He had been at the barbecue, but swore he hadn't stuck a note on the refrigerator, wasn't interested in me like that, quote-unquote, and anyway, his name was Logan Baumgartner, not Logan Nelson. Kyle wasn't so sure, so I managed to talk him down, which is lucky because I think he was about ready to pound Logan Baumgartner into the dirt. And that evening when I came home from school, Dad and Uncle Chris were watching the game. I asked Dad if he'd seen anyone come into the house during the barbecue, and the house was typically out of bounds during our BBQs except for people using the bathroom, so people went in and out but wouldn't linger. Dad couldn't recall seeing anyone in particular, but Chris said Kyle and a couple of his buddies had been hanging around the kitchen. Obviously, Kyle hadn't seen anyone suspicious, but I called him later that night and asked if he could check with his buddies, or see if any of them recalled the note on the refrigerator to try and pinpoint exactly when it had been posted. I was beginning to feel like a crack detective, and then everything simply cracked. The next evening, Logan Nelson posted on my MySpace wall saying something about how he wanted to see my insides. Now anyways, this was pretty clear in a concise thread, so I told my dad and Uncle Chris. Now they were both absolutely fuming. Uncle Chris, who at the time was working night security, offered to swing by the house regularly on his off nights and keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. No less than 2 days later, while me and my family were blissfully asleep, Chris reported catching an intruder peeping into my bedroom window. He'd leaped out of the car and gave chase, but this black-clad figure had apparently given him the slip while leaping through neighbors' gardens and over back fences into their yards. Chris had returned to his car and sat outside our house for the rest of the night, until we were up and awake and he could let us know what had just happened. I didn't really understand why at the time, but we decided not to call the cops the first time, and I was told that Chris and Dad decided that it would be better if we just handled it ourselves. This didn't make me feel very safe, but they knew best. And by this point, I blocked Logan Nelson on MySpace, but I kept receiving dozens of spam requests. I'd also received random friend requests and abusive messages on every messenger program I used, and it was really starting to terrify me, this guy watching me from somewhere. What about the nights when Uncle Chris couldn't keep an eye on the house? This guy could be outside looking in, and maybe one day he'd break in and take things further. I expressed my fear to Dad and Uncle Chris and suggested again that we just call the cops. Dad was taking my side, but Uncle Chris said that he had 2 weeks vacation from work and would be able to monitor the house a lot better. Now he suggested that we could handle the guy our way, and this seemed to win Dad over. They'd always been those kind of brothers. The spam and abuse online kept coming. Different accounts every day, different threats to my email before I blocked each and every one, threats of violence and worse, and it was driving me nuts and making me feel so unsafe. I begged Dad again to call the cops, and he finally agreed. Unfortunately, my paranoid ass had been deleting most of the emails and messages from the stalker, but I kept the note from the refrigerator and a couple of the latest emails. Dad and I took them to the station that afternoon. The female cop I saw was really helpful and sympathetic. Unfortunately, she explained that there wasn't much they could do with what we had, but told us to keep collecting information and evidence. They did take the note away for processing, but we'd all handled it so there really wasn't much of a chance of finding fingerprints or anything. That night, I awoke to a loud commotion in the backyard. The clock read after 2 in the morning, and I grabbed a robe and covered myself and then looked out. Uncle Chris was standing in the back, yelling and waving some kind of bat. Dad and I rushed outside. Chris was out there with a neighbor hollering about an intruder. When he calmed down, He told us that he'd caught a figure in a hoodie peering through my bedroom window. He tried to sneak up on that intruder but startled him and the guy ran off again. Then the neighbor came out, saw Uncle Chris in the backyard, thought that he was an intruder, and began to threaten him. Eventually everyone calmed down and Chris was trying to get Dad and the neighbor to go canvassing the streets with him, but in the end, they decided the guy must be long gone. Now the next few days were hell. The online abuse ramped up, and it seemed like no matter how many accounts I blocked, a new one would message me, and now the abuse had become more targeted too. Very few people knew this, but in my sophomore year, I suffered from an eating disorder and even spent a few weeks in a clinic during the summer break. I'd recovered fully, and only those closest to me knew about it, but it had been a long and hard road to get over, and at times I still felt those intrusive thoughts coming back. And so it was pretty unwelcome when my stalkers started calling me fat and obese, a pig, and a disgusting flesh monster, all sorts of lovely things. That dress you wore today doesn't fit you very well. Maybe try 10 sizes up, they say. Didn't know that they let pigs into our high school. Saw you in the cafeteria stuffing your face today. Disgusting. I hadn't even eaten in the freaking cafeteria that day. I hadn't eaten anything because the weight paranoia was coming back thanks to this stalker. Now, we filed reports with the cops about all this online abuse, but back in 2008, being an online target wasn't taken seriously at all by the law, even if the cops were sympathetic. And since we only had Uncle Chris's eyewitness account of a potential intruder, it was hard to escalate things legally. Now, Kyle tried his best to make me feel better, constantly telling me that I was beautiful and I shouldn't listen. And he knew about the eating disorder, of course, although we hadn't started dating yet when I was hospitalized for it. Kyle's attempts weren't really working, though, and I was falling back into the rabbit hole of hating myself. Now, one morning, I found a huge cake shoved into our mailbox. Flies were swarming around it, and the entire space in the mailbox was filled with disgusting cream frosting and stale baked goods. Now, it must have been done before our mail arrived because the mailman alerted us about it. And that same day, I received a bunch of spam emails asking if I enjoyed the cake, with things like oink oink written in them and then photos of pigs. Uncle Chris was still on his vacation days, so he promised to up his patrols, and he said he hadn't been there the night before due to a date, which I couldn't really hold against him. That night, though, every time I peeked out my window, I saw him sitting in his car, either reading or napping, and it did make me feel safer. But what a fool I was, as if anything was keeping me safe. Now, it was past 4 this time when I was woken up by a commotion. More than a commotion, actually. A rock came hurtling through my window, smashing the glass and sending a shard flying right past my leg and even cutting me slightly. I screamed and ran into the house. Mom and my siblings were already cowering in the living room and Dad was unlocking the gun cabinet. I'd completely forgotten my little sidearm in my bedroom safe, so much for that. And Dad ran outside, and against my mom's wishes, I followed him. Uncle Chris was out there again, and this time surrounded by a bunch of neighbors. Chris had a wild story to tell. He'd driven to the Piggly Wiggly to grab some snacks and got caught up chatting to the kid working the register. Now, Uncle Chris was kind of like that. He could somehow strike up a conversation with anyone, and so he drove back to his stakeout and caught a creeper staring into my window again. And without thinking, Uncle Chris said that he leaped out of his car, swiped up a rock, and hurled it at the intruder. He missed, of course, and that's what had smashed my window. Uncle Chris himself had actually thrown that rock. Of course, this drew the neighbors out again, and a few of the neighbor guys were scouring the area for that black-clad intruder that Uncle Chris described. Chris was really riled up, waving his gun around as he spoke, and Dad had to take him to one side and tell him to calm down before somebody got shot. He'd already thrown a rock through my bedroom window, which Dad was pissed at him about. It was impossible for any of us to get to sleep that night, and not really worth trying as the sun would soon be up. Now, my younger siblings did go back to bed, so did my mom, but Dad, Uncle Chris, and I sat in the kitchen just drinking coffee, and I thought that we were waiting for the cops to arrive, but apparently I was wrong. And that's when Uncle Chris dropped a bombshell. He said that he couldn't be sure. He stressed this over and over again, but he wanted to tell me just in case. He said that when he threw the rock, that peeping Tom had turned and his mask had slipped, and Chris had gotten a glimpse of a face that he was sure was Kyle. My boyfriend, Kyle. Kyle, my boyfriend, my stalker? Could it be? Now, I thought about it. None of the online abuse had come through exactly when I was with Kyle, and the note had been left on the refrigerator when Kyle was in and out of the house. Kyle knew about my eating disorder. But why? Why would Kyle, the guy I loved, do this to me? No, Uncle Chris had to be wrong. Kyle wouldn't have the time or energy to make all these fake accounts, do all this harassment, shove a cake into my mailbox. Uncle Chris could have seen any white, normal-looking teenage boy and jumped to conclusions, and Kyle wouldn't do this to me. I mean, he wouldn't, would he? Now, I didn't want to raise the issue with Kyle. I was still very insecure, and I was worried that even asking him about it might cause him to break up with me. It's dumb, I know, and Kyle must have been able to tell that I was distant with him, though, because he asked what was up between us when he called me on Friday night. And I just broke down and told him how bad I was feeling because of the stalker, how insecure and scared that I was, and I mentioned that I felt so unsafe at school, knowing that this guy was watching me from somewhere at every turn, and wanted to try to fish for any clues that Kyle might feel guilty. And that's when Kyle pointed out something interesting. He said something like, "Well, the stalker hasn't actually done anything at school, right?" And when I thought about it, he was right. All the harassment had taken place in and around my home, and I never received any anonymous notes in my locker, nothing slipped into my coat or bag during school. And the stalker had left a note in my home, filled the mailbox with cake, and been caught lurking around my bedroom window by Uncle Chris a couple of times. "There's no actual proof he goes to school with us," Kyle had said. And then I thought about the messages. They would be sent to my email, my MySpace profile, Friendster, etc., and I never really paid attention to when they were posted, just when I received them, which was after I returned home from school. I've been saving them for the police reports, so I went back and checked while on the phone with Kyle, and the messages that were timed or dated had all been posted at random times throughout the day, although never mid-morning. Whoever it was knew certain details, though, like what I'd worn to school some days, and then Kyle reminded me about other details that were wrong, like the time the stalker had given me crap for stuffing my face in the cafeteria when I hadn't even eaten my lunch in the cafeteria that day. And this revelation didn't make things better, though. If anything, it just widened the pool of suspects to an almost impossible size. Now, this really caused me to start panicking, and I broke down on the phone and started crying and hyperventilating. Kyle insisted that he was coming over there and then, and we lived across town, and it was nearly midnight, so I told him not to, but he was insistent. He wanted to check on me, so I hung up the phone and waited for him. I'm feeling good that I had a boyfriend who dropped everything on a Friday night to come and see me. I was checking my messages that night, hoping that something would come through while Kyle was on the drive over, proving that he wasn't the one sending the abuse. Now, by this point, I was pretty certain he wasn't, but the confirmation would have been nice. I got the confirmation that night, but not in the way that I could have ever expected. I was reading, I think, when the commotion sounded from outside. This was beginning to become a routine now. Yelling, shouting, and then a crash. I rushed to the window. Kyle was struggling with someone on the lawn. They were both rolling around out there, and neighbors were already beginning to emerge. I saw Dad step onto our lawn holding his shotgun. I ran outside. Dad had his shotgun trained on these two men, Kyle and Uncle Chris. Kyle had his hands held behind his head while Chris was shouting and ranting. "Shut up," Dad screamed at him. I was shocked to see this gun swing in Chris's direction, and I was even more shocked to hear what Kyle was saying. Kyle had pulled up around the corner outside of our cul-de-sac and walked around the block of my house to avoid waking my family. Now, by now, it was nearly 1 in the morning. As he'd approached around the back, where my room looked out over, he'd seen a figure standing in my window. It was very clear from his motions that the guy was pleasuring himself. Kyle had yelled and then tackled him and started beating on the guy. And that's when he realized it was Uncle Chris. Now, Uncle Chris denied this, and of course he hadn't been touching himself. He'd just been on his patrol, like usual, keeping me safe. No, this could have been believed, except Dad's eyes traveled down to Chris's crotch. His fly was clearly undone, and his clothing was very disheveled. Now, when Uncle Chris saw where Dad had been looking, his face went as white as a goddamn sheet. It had always been Uncle Chris leading this narrative, and it had been Uncle Chris who had been caught in the backyard by the neighbor that first time and come up with some story about how he'd been chasing a mysterious third party. It had been Uncle Chris who threw the rock at my window, claiming that there was an intruder. It had been Uncle Chris who had repeatedly persuaded us to keep the cops' involvement to a minimum so we could handle it ourselves. Uncle Chris, who was at our house either most mornings or most evenings, who would know what I was wearing to school, who would have time in the day to send various abusive messages. Uncle Chris, who could easily have slipped into the house during the barbecue and left the note on that refrigerator. Uncle Chris, who was able to shove cake into the mailbox because he was the one keeping the house safe, quote-unquote, in the first place. Uncle Chris knew all about my eating disorder, my insecurities, my weaknesses, and fears. Uncle Chris, my dad's flesh and blood brother, who'd been a beloved presence in my life since I was born, stalking me, harassing me, fantasizing about me, and that trauma still exists for me 16 years later. Now, I'll summarize everything briefly, as we did get the cops involved, but the online stalking charges didn't amount to much back then, and it was Kyle's word against Chris that he'd been perving on me through the window. Ultimately, there wasn't much that we could achieve with the law. Why did Chris do all of this? It turned out that he'd always incredibly hated my dad for marrying my mom. Chris was the older brother and had secretly harbored a thing for my mom, and I don't know the extent of it, and I don't want to know, but he came clean about a bunch of small yet spiteful acts that he'd committed against my dad and our family over the years. Accidents that weren't really accidents, damage around the house that happened mysteriously, neighborhood kids keying Dad's car, all sorts of amounts of small yet terrifying incidents, and then apparently when I hit 18, I quote-unquote blossomed into looking too close to Mom, and that made him hate me too, as well as apparently, well, yeah. So he decided to hurt our whole family in one evil go. And after all this came out, we've never seen Chris again. Dad had passed away 10 years later and Mom just a couple of years ago. My two siblings were doing well as they both lived overseas and haven't heard from Chris. As for me, the event destroyed my trust and my life. And Kyle and I didn't stay together for much longer after that because I simply couldn't bring myself to trust anyone close to me at all. Chris had been like a second father figure to me, and to say that I took all this hard would be an understatement. It was devastating. There's no happy ending. It just makes me sad that Dad never lived to see Chris put in the ground. That's happened now, though, and apparently he listed me as his closest living relative because a few weeks ago I was informed that Chris had died in a motorcycle accident a few states over. Apparently he was strung out on meth and showed signs of long-term addiction. I don't think I'll have any more involvement than being informed, but I'm glad to know that he's gone, and I hope it was painful. I have moved on, and I have a partner and family of my own, and I'm just very grateful that my kids can't grow up with a terrifying paternal uncle, because my husband is an only child. So I just wanted to tell you about my last date. His name was Greg, and he was perfect. I met him on Grindr, and I genuinely saw a future with this guy. And I guess there was a future, just not a future that I could have ever predicted. Now, we chatted on the app for a few days before deciding on our first date. A lunch date picnic in the park. And I booked it during our lunch hour because, well, I was on my lunch hour, and I also knew that there'd be a bunch of other people around. Always important for a first date or a first time meeting a new person. Now, I'm not really new to the dating game. I'm the type of guy who struggles to settle down. Well, not yet anyway, and not that I sleep around or have multiple people on the go at once. I'm just really picky and I get tired of people's idiosyncrasies very quick. Now, I know this makes me kind of flaky and unappealing as a prospective partner, so I try and make up for that in other ways by keeping myself well-groomed and fit, etc. I want people to give me a chance, even if I'm not always best at doing the same in kind. Now, Greg was wonderful. Mid-20s, I'm late 20s. He was very calm, gentle, almost quiet. A very thoughtful guy. Now, our lunch date ran longer because we spent so long talking about literature, art, movies, politics, you name it. Everything we could think to talk about, and we found very mutual interest in each of the topics. Now, you could say that we really clicked. The date had to end because I could only be so late getting back to work, and I was feeling really good about this one, though. And it seemed as if Greg felt the same about me because he messaged me that same evening saying that he'd had an amazing time and would I like to do it again. Well, would I? And so we arranged for another lunch date, and this time on a day that we both had time off of work. Now, I work as a junior lawyer at a firm, and Greg, well, he told me he worked in fashion. Who really knows, though? We met at an Olive Garden and had another lovely time. Over breadsticks, I brought up the fact that I was bisexual. Now, this can be a showstopper for some gay men. There's all sorts of prejudice towards bisexuals from both sides of the fence, so I like to bring it up ASAP, and if it's going to be an issue, then there's plenty of time for both of us to just bail. Now, Greg seemed completely unbothered by this, and even asked about previous partners, whether I thought it was easier being bisexual than gay or straight, and he told me he'd always considered that it would be harder for a variety of reasons. He was very sincere and sweet about it. He had a youthful curiosity about life that just really appealed to me. Now, for our third date, we went out for dinner at a small, family-owned restaurant near my apartment. I like to eat late on weekends, and Greg was acquiescent to that, so I booked a table for 9 p.m., that is. Now, we had a delightful time. Neither of us drank, and I offered to order a bottle of wine, but Greg had driven to the restaurant and told me that he wouldn't even have a sip of alcohol if he was driving, and I could respect that. And so the night played out wonderfully. It was just past midnight when we went out to the parking lot, and there, pressed against Greg's car, we shared our first kiss. I genuinely felt sparks, and it was wonderful. Which is why I was a tiny bit puzzled when Greg bid me a good night, got into his car, and drove off. He didn't even offer me a ride home or anything. I've been planning to invite him in, actually. And still, it didn't get to me too much, though. The kiss had clearly been full of passion, and I don't think Greg had lost interest. He was probably trying to play it coy and hadn't quite landed it. And by the time I'd walked a few blocks, I'd convinced myself it was just that. And when he sent me a message a couple of minutes later thanking me for an amazing night and implying that next time it should be an overnighter, my fears were alleviated. At least, my fears about Greg. The route back from that restaurant was about a half-hour's walk through suburbs, but in between the restaurant and my suburb, there was a shortcut through a forest path that would save about 10 minutes of walking. Now, when I say forest, it was more of a public park, so it had sporadic lighting, and although I wouldn't recommend it at night, I felt comfortably safe as a fit late-20s guy who works out and feel like I can handle myself in a fight. Now, that didn't stop me from feeling jumpy when I kept hearing twigs cracking behind me, though. I'd walk a few feet and turn, and absolutely certain that I'd heard rustling in the undergrowth. I'd walk a bit more, and suddenly branches would swish and a stick crunches, spin around again, and nothing. That kind of thing. Was there a shadow lurking past the tree line? I couldn't be sure, and instead I just stuck my head down and kept on walking through those woods. I heard a crack. Oh, there's definitely somebody there, and I called out. "Hey, you got a problem, buddy?" It was a stupid thing to say, and all I got back was silence. Now, I stuck my hands in my pockets and just kept on walking. It was the middle of last summer, but a sudden chill had gone through my spine. There were these light patters of rain beginning to hit my overcoat. Perfect, I thought. I sped up, convincing my inner machismo that it was due to the rain, not the fear of being stalked. Now, thankfully, I exited the forest and began walking the few blocks to the small, single-story suburban house that I'd purchased from my parents when they moved to Florida. And I glanced around nervously over my shoulder and saw someone lingering under a streetlight. He wasn't looking in my direction, and he could have been anyone, but he hadn't been there when I walked past. And now it looks like he was standing still. I pretended to check my phone, keeping an eye on this guy, and I couldn't see his face, but he looked pretty built. Or maybe he was just wearing layers, it was hard to tell. My night vision isn't the best, and he was right under the street lamp. Now, the best thing to do, I decided, was just ignore him, but I did reach into my pocket and grip my keys as a sort of makeshift weapon. Now, 3 more times on the walk back, I became absolutely certain that I was being followed. Every time I'd whip around and nobody would be there, except I'd always see leaves fluttering as if they'd just been disturbed, or a bush seemed to be swaying as if someone had brushed past it, but I thought it was the wind. Now, one time again, I called out asking if anyone was following me, and the porch light of a nearby house flicked on. I wasn't sure if it was a motion sensor or whether I'd just woken somebody up, so I kept on going. Now, I finally arrived home. My car was sat in the driveway, and I could see that the living room light was on through the huge bay windows that looked into the front yard, and I let myself in with my key. "Honey, I'm home," I yelled. It was sort of a reoccurring joke, but I was also kind of trying to reassure myself. My roommate Meg, not her real name, but she does love Family Guy, was up and, as usual, was burning the midnight oil and working on her dissertation. And that was her excuse anyways, as she was really just wanting the details of my date. She knew that I'd really been digging this Greg guy, and she and her boyfriend Simon were really hoping that I'd find someone to settle down with. She asked how things went, and I'd said I'd tell her all about it. So we made some drinks and took it into the living room. I took the couch and Meg took the single-seater recliner, and we both put our cups on the table. I sort of leaned back satisfied, and then the front window exploded. Yeah, everything seemed to happen almost in slow motion. I briefly caught movement outside in that darkness, and then something hit the window, hard enough to send the glass shattering in an explosion of sparkling shards. No sooner had that happened than something distinctly man-sized bursting through the open, sending further explosions of glass around the room. Now this figure landed on his feet on our living room floor, shook himself like a goddamn dog shaking off water, shards of splintered glass flying everywhere, and me and Meg holding up our arms to protect our faces. This man screamed something indiscernible. Something like that, I don't even know, but I could hear dark, ragged breaths coming from him. Who was this? Some meth head here to rob us, I thought. Someone on bath salts, a neighbor, an Amazon delivery driver. All of these thoughts were bursting through my head in half a second. No. You already know who it is, right? It was Greg. And Greg gestured wildly at us with this tire iron that he just used to smash our front bay window in.
I effing knew it,
he grunted again. I just stared at him in shock. Meg stared too, and of course she had no idea who he was at all, having only just seen him in one or two pictures on my phone. And here, he looked frantic and feral. I started to stand, but Greg swung that tire iron dangerously close to me, so I sat back down on the couch.
I knew it,
he said.
I knew you were married. I could see a pale band on your ring finger. You were hiding your wedding ring.
This was, of course, complete nonsense. I'm not married and never have been. Whatever kind of paranoia Greg had about dating a married man, he must have projected it so hard onto me that he saw a clue that wasn't even there.
So this is Greg. Greg, this is my roommate Meg.
And at that exact moment, at that exact perfect moment, the living room door bursts open, and Simon stumbles into the room, bleary-eyed with bedhead and clutching our baseball bat.
And this is Meg's boyfriend, Simon,
I added. Now Greg just stared between the three of us. His expression changed like 10 times in a matter of seconds. Fury, horror, fear, anger, sadness, nausea, fury again, and then finally sort of bemused.
Oh, well, sorry.
Now he couldn't even blame it on the alcohol. He didn't have a drop to drink that night. Now what happened was, Greg had previously suffered a couple of bad experiences with Grindr dates, go figure. Specifically straight or bi-curious men trying out the lifestyle with Greg without a care for his feelings. And he said it happened a lot, but I imagine it was more like once or twice. And I got the impression that Greg fell for people easily, and he fell for them hard. So instead of waiting for me to break his heart, he decided to feign driving home, and then parked away from the restaurant and followed me back on foot with the hopes of allaying his wild paranoia when he saw that I lived alone. On the walk there, he'd managed to convince himself that he'd noticed a pale band of flesh on my ring finger in the restaurant's lighting, and that for some reason, this is why I'd only agreed to dates in the daytime before then, as if that made any kind of sense. Now, I don't think people like Greg ever made much sense because he was clearly very, very mentally unwell and needed help. And that's why it killed me to call the cops and actually press charges, because I knew that I had to, because at least that might lead to him being forced to get help. Now, he didn't have to go to jail, but there was a fine, and I'm told that he underwent some court-appointed anger management nonsense. I don't think anger was his biggest problem, though. I think he needed help, but hey, I'm not a doctor. I haven't been on any dates since Greg last summer, not through Grindr or Tinder or any other means. And for now, I'm perfectly happy to work on myself platonically. Greg, if you're somehow listening to this, I wish you all the best, and I'm sure you'll make someone a great partner one day. But for you and I, please, let's not